There's something really satisfying about the three-act structure. It's why we see it in so many great works. We see it in Dante's Divine Comedy. We see it in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. We see it in a lot of modern literature too, things like fantasy, sci-fi, and just about every young adult series of novels that you can find. We even see it in pop culture phenomena, like Star Wars. And I mention this structure because it helps us understand what we're really doing here tonight. But we hear about it at the beginning of Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, or reading from there tonight. Maundy Thursday isn't simply a day where we remember the Last Supper. If that were the case, we would go with the later and alternate gospel reading choice for this evening, which comes from Luke and is, in fact, that Last Supper narrative. No, instead, our gospel reading, a bold and ancient choice to read tonight, comes from the Gospel of John. And it's in that narrative. We don't hear about the Last Supper. We hear instead about the washing of feet. At the very end of our gospel reading today, we hear Jesus giving a new commandment: to love one another as I have loved you. Maundy, or mandate, our name for this day, it comes from this very verse, this new command to love one another as Jesus has loved us. So today, in the midst of what we hear of this night for Jesus, this night with Jesus and his disciples, what we're really getting is the first book of a trilogy, or as we call it in the church, the Triduum. These three services that really mark the core story of our faith. These services, these three services, were once viewed really as one giant service, celebrated over 3 days. Those services are what we celebrate today, Maundy Thursday, what we'll celebrate tomorrow, Good Friday. And finally, we have the last service to end all of these three services, the great vigil of Easter. All these stories tell us about, first, Jesus' final hours with the disciples, what we remember tonight, and then his trial and death, and finally, his resurrection. This is not unlike, and we can take Star Wars again as a way for us to understand what's going on here. Because in the original Star Wars trilogy, we have the first movie, the suffering yet hope under the Empire, and we get devastating loss. Finally, we see the victory of good. We do not, and we cannot celebrate this night without understanding this full context of the Triduum services. This night isn't simply about celebrating the institution of the Eucharist. It's about remembering all that Jesus did that night. That includes the washing of the disciples' feet. All these things that Jesus is doing help prepare the disciples for what is to come, not just with Jesus' death, but just with Jesus' resurrection, their life and service to our Lord after. In that command we hear this night, the command to love one another. Not only is Jesus doing that work of the first act, to prepare the disciples for what is to come. Jesus is giving them a sign, what we'll see tomorrow, a sign of Jesus' love, his act of love on the cross. And we see the great vigil of Easter, the result of that love. Best, a look at the Last Supper this evening helps remind us of the place of this event within our wider faith. And that's why Paul's account of the institution begins with the context, the wider context for this meal. On the night in which he was betrayed, as Paul tells us. So when we celebrate this event, not only today, but every Sunday that we gather together, we're not just celebrating the Last Supper. We're not just celebrating that event in and of itself. We're celebrating it in the fullness of all these events we are gathering in these next few days to celebrate and to remember. In this, we celebrate the whole context, the entirety of what Jesus has done in this world. The entirety of Jesus' act, the entirety of our faith. That is what we do every time we celebrate the Eucharist. These next 3 days, we'll be looking at these events so much closer. We'll see the fullness of Jesus' love, the love of one who is willing to die for us, to rise for us again. So don't limit the scope of what today, what Maundy, Thursday, is really about. It's not simply about communion. It's about so much more. It's the start of Jesus' great act of love for us. It's about Jesus leaving that message of that love in this final gathering with his disciples. It's about the start of that great trilogy, the Triduum, which places itself at the very core of our faith.